Well, hello everyone. Here I am. Finally got off work after a very, very long time on there. And of course, part of getting off work means I get to do a little shopping. So I went to my favorite coin dealer and got one of these. It's in a plastic case. I did take it out just to check it. But he said, hey, it has a decent amount of numismatic value. It's not a rare coin or anything, but this is a proof of it, apparently, which I guess is just a really nice coin. Uh, American Eagle. So there's a little bit of a premium. That's usually not the way I like to do it. I like to just get bullion and not worry about the numismatic value. A, because I don't know that much about it. B, if I ever wanted to resell it, it becomes an issue of what's the grade, whatever. This comes in a nice, felt case. These were put out by the U.S. Mint in 1987. This particular one. Um, but he didn't really have a lot of bullion on hand. My dealer, kind of interesting way, he said that he has buyers who will buy every single piece of gold that he has. Anything that he is able to get a hold of, he has buyers who will buy all of it. He has one particular buyer who will buy everything. I wish it was me. It's not. And he does not like to sell out of everything because he likes to have something available for other customers. Uh, just so that he can kind of retain them. And he says it's just a few people, me and a few others, who are even interested in buying bullion. And so he's like 90% of what he gets, and he gets his inventory at a fairly regular basis, goes to this one seller, and then he retains, a few other things he won't sell to that guy. Just in the offhand, one of his other customers comes in, and I think if he ends up holding it for very long and it doesn't look like he is going to sell it, then he sells it to that guy. So I don't like paying premiums on rare coins. If you were a coin collector and you were interested in rare coins, that's a different story. But I'm not interested in that regard. However, I would much rather pay the premium and walk out of there with a coin rather than not exchange my money. The other thing he did have, um, I much prefer 1 ounce coins, but I was able to get a little stack. This is 8. He only had 8. These are tenth ounce Krugerrands. Most of my coins are Krugerrands, but mostly they're 1 ounces. Uh, but he had these, and it's not even a full ounce, so there's an eighth of an ounce, plus a little bit more because they had copper to these. Um, so that felt good. I was happy that he had some in the store. Sometimes I've gone in there and he says it's, I'll come back in a week or whatever. But he had some other ones. He had some Chinese 1/4 ounce and also a 50 peso, which was 0.48 ounces. Yeah, I was interested, but I don't want to get too diversified here, although gold is gold. So what I wanted to talk about here is a topic that I've kind of covered in 2 other videos, but they're relatively old, um, and that's basically peak oil. I did a peak oil video, and then after I did that, I read Julian Simon's book, The Ultimate Resource, and in my video about that, I kind of talk about peak oil. But people ask me about it fairly regularly whenever they figure out that I kind of work in the industry. And I have to qualify, it's a big industry and it's very, very much benefiting from the division of labor, which is to say there's a lot of people who do different jobs and there's a lot of specialization. That's part of what I do is a very, very specialized task. And although that's very efficient and it means that people have a lot of information about their particular tasks, it also means that you don't necessarily have a ton of knowledge about every aspect of the industry. Although that would be very hard anyway because it's such a big thing. Um, but I mean, that would be like asking someone who works at a restaurant, asking a waiter, how much do they know about agriculture and how to grow and produce crops and meat or whatever. They probably don't know that much, and it's not really a slight against them. Uh, and so the fact that I work in quote unquote the oil industry, even though most of the wells I do are all natural gas, it's still called the oil industry generally. I don't necessarily know everything about every facet of it. Uh, and I also want to be careful that I don't come across as someone who is blind to the problems with the industry or as an apologist. I see this. I know other oil and gas people who are like this, who are basically, since some people in society don't like the industry, and since they do like the industry, and people in the industry tend to like it, the pay tends to be relatively good. There tends to be a lot of meritocracy in it. Not totally. There's more overt cronyism and nepotism in the oil industry than I've seen in other industries, but that's something I think you're going to get everywhere. And even though there are bad apples with connections who rise to the top or do very well, people who work hard and are good at their job also tend to do very well because it's profitable for the companies to do that. And so there's a certain loyalty and there's a certain defensiveness also where people like to imagine that oil and gas is the linchpin of society. This is a bias most people have in their especially in their careers. It's one thing if you have a job. Most people who work at Burger King, they don't intend to work there forever, and so they don't necessarily consider Burger King or fast food to be the linchpin of society. But once people settle into a career, there's a tendency for them to overrate its importance um, relative to everything else. And I think this is kind of natural, both in terms of people's egoism and also just their rational ignorance. When you don't know as much about other industries, you tend to discount what goes into them, and whereas your own personal industry, you tend to know all the little details and all the little trials and tribulations that come with it, and so there's a tendency to do that. And I always shy away. Like the more division of labor, the better. The other thing is from a free market perspective, the oil and gas industry has at differing layers, bottlenecks that are created by regulatory capture. There's also an awful lot of indirect subsidy. Most obviously, if we're talking about oil, in the basically in the government having selected uh, a particular type of, the market created several different types of transit. Market produces several different types of transit. It produces airplanes, it produces trains, it produces all manner of ship, and of course it produces automobiles and trucking and all that, and probably others I haven't mentioned. And the state subsidizes, well, it subsidizes all of them to one degree or another, but it has singled out um, road productions and so indirectly the auto and then the oil and gas industries as as a major subsidy, as something that it really focuses on. I don't know. I don't think that there was probably an explicit decision to do this, other than perhaps in the 1950s during the big interstate um, push. And of course, that wasn't really to stimulate the economy or anything. That was to give the federal government more hegemony over the United States. The classic example that people get is not far off target, but just a little bit inverted. People believe that it was created so that the military could better defend the United States. The idea being if the Russians were to invade, an interstate highway system would greatly aid the deployment of military forces. Um, I suppose that's true, but that's also a double-edged sword. It would also mean that any invading force would have the luxury of roads. I think the Germans would have been very, very pleased if the Russians had created a interstate uh, transit system for them to have roads on, because then they wouldn't have been so dependent on just a few spindly little off-gauge railroads. But the truth is more likely that Germans or Russians invading was not the primary instinct in creating the road system. It was more likely a desire to prevent what happened in 1861 through 65 from happening again. It increases the government's ability to deploy within the United States and to suppress any potential rebellions. Not that I think that was particularly likely in the 50s, but that is why the government has an incentive to do. I think there also is a bit of a ribbon cutting tendency where roads are something very easy. Most people tend to see them as good things, and so regardless of the fact of whether that particular road, it's one thing to say roads can be useful, but where you put them is actually pretty significant, and what types. To just build 4-lane superhighways, that doesn't make a lot of sense to do in many scenarios. There's plenty of places where something far, far cheaper would be just as good. So it's far too simplistic to simply say, well, this is good, so if the government just goes around creating it, that's just, there's nothing to argue about that. Well, yeah, if they're wasting resources building things that aren't needed, or to areas that aren't needed, and totally tangent on the road here, but back to the oil and gas industry. Uh, there are bottlenecks. The biggest one that I know of, and I might be wrong about this, is in the refining industry. The number of companies that can refine is limited. It's set, and also even the number of refineries is set, and so there's no competition in that area. And like I said, that's a bottleneck. There's several others. There are also other aspects of the industry that I don't like. Property rights are basically kind of subject to a quasi eminent domain. That, I'm surprised people don't talk about this, because the big case, I think it was in Connecticut, the Kelo case, where the Supreme Court said the government can use eminent domain to take private property and then give it to other private property. So eminent domain was always considered legitimate. I would say completely erroneously, but always considered it legitimate to say build a road or do something for the government. But to take it and then say give it to a developer, there was some question about that, and the Supreme Court said uh, that's okay. Well, of course they did, because if it's the government's to take in the first place, then it's the government's to dispose with as they see fit. If that means they want to build a road or a school or a hospital or give it away to some crony, it's theirs. They can give it away. I mean, logically. Um, in terms of oil and gas, um, property owners, and I don't believe people necessarily own the resources under their feet. I remember talking to a socialist, and he was like, well, the poor people in other countries, they own the resources under their feet. I don't buy that. I think that's kind of a weird proprietarian idea that isn't reliant on any really convincing idea that's not arbitrary. The idea that I'm walking around on a piece of property, and oil and gas that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 feet below me is mine. It's not quite obvious to me how that's really the case, but it's also relatively irrelevant, because the surface that I maintain, whether it's via my yard or agriculturally or through some other business or that I paved, that is mine. And the only way that oil and gas companies can extract oil and gas is through an access point through land. And if by some chance they happen to want to use my land as an access point, then what the terms of that exchange are totally between the two of us. And I should have every right to say, under no situation will I allow this. Um, or if I do allow it, conditional on whatever remuneration, onyomi, I don't recall that's how you say it, remuneration, although I can't hear it that way. It sounds like remuneration to me, but whatever. Um, we come to a decision. Now, I know this is something I don't think the federal government does so often, but the states certainly do it. They basically have wage and price controls when it comes to this. They basically say there's a formula, and the oil companies control here. They usually can't say demolish your house, but they're allowed to be so close, and you really can't say no. I know this isn't the case in Texas. If you own a ranch, you can't tell people, no, you can't drill on my land. They can drill on your land. They have to pay you back. There's a scale, there's a fee that's assessed, but you don't get to actually negotiate that, so it's not really a market price at all. My guess is that on net, at that point of production, that is lowering the price. However, when you have an oligopoly at refining, that's going to raise the price. So if I was going to aggregate all of the subsidies slash taxes, it's hard for me to say what the net effect would be, other than it's probably raising the price. So after 14 minutes of introduction, let me just say that I think that peak oil is kind of a concept that doesn't really make sense in a market economy. Uh, the and this is going to rely very heavily on Julian Simon. There might be a finite mass or physical quantity of a given resource, so we might measure, hydrocarbons, and say, well, there's this many hydrocarbon atoms in the earth, and surely there is a limit. It's not an infinite quantity that can be measured. although how much is actually a very indefinite question, because, and as he points out in the book, actually establishing how much there is requires a cost. So nobody in the world right now is just saying let's systematically, as thoroughly as possible, determine how many hydrocarbons there are in the world, because that would be enormously expensive. I mean, they'd be having to comb the entire oceans, Antarctica, every jungle, every mountain, every desert, every urban center, which are in a strange way sort of like caps. You know, big urban centers tend to block a lot of production. I'm not lamenting that. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact, you know, where I drill, there's a town, and they never drill right in the town, but they've drilled all the way around the town, and one can imagine easily thousands of wells, or at least hundreds of wells. And that's a relatively small town. You talk about a place like New York City or Beijing or Mexico City, or I don't know if they produce much oil and gas around there, but potentially large quantities in those areas. Um, it's too expensive to go and basically survey the entire Earth. And so what tends to happen is when there's a demand for more gas, most of the resources go to what is thought to be the most recoverable areas. So they're not going to places that they think are not going to have very much oil and gas. They're scrutinizing areas that they are pretty sure do, and that's where the lion's share of. So the projection of how much there is always changing. It's always expanding. Now, it doesn't mean it always will expand. It doesn't mean that there's no limit. It just means that, well, our current reserves are X. I mean, the current reserves, and this is really true with natural gas in the United States. Um, uh, New technologies have made areas that were considered worthless before. They knew that there was gas in them, but it was not producible. Suddenly become immeasurably, well, not immeasurably, but extremely valuable, uh, and able to produce gigantic quantities of gas. Um, you've got the Marcellus Shale, the Bakken Shale out in North Dakota, the Eagleford Shale down in Texas. My guess is there are probably other fields that are probably just as big that just they haven't been on the map. They haven't. Right now, there's so much in these fields that it's taking all the resources of the oil companies, or not all, but a huge portion of them, just to extract from those areas. That they can't really spend a lot of time to go and check the frackability or the viability of dark shale formations in other regions, even regions that they might be drilling it for other sources. So there's that, but ultimately there is a finite supply. On the other hand, though, how much yield you get out of a given mass of resources is not something that can be taken for granted. Um, how much electricity you can produce out of a given amount of hydrocarbons varies on how efficient your engine is that's converting, and like they become much more efficient over time, or whatever other method you use to derive, whether it's heat energy or electric energy or whatever. And so, if we were to look at 1950s technology, the potential to power or satisfy our electrical needs would be one number, but with greater technology, it would be a much larger number. And so, um, even if we could exactly quantify the amount of hydrocarbons in the Earth, which is theoretically possible, but it's not practically possible at this time anyway, um, that wouldn't give us a definite picture of what valuable goods that quantity of resource would actually yield us. Um, it used to be you just took coal and you burn it in an open hearth and it generates heat, and maybe you can cook with it and boil water. But now coke furnaces are much, 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 much more efficient. And so, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. The other thing is, as something becomes more expensive, people kind of dismiss. They always just kind of think, well, yeah, like things are okay now, but that's just because we were really lucky and we have these technological advances. And once those dry up, the old technologies, they won't expand the resource base necessarily, which is true. Current technologies don't expand the resource base. If we don't ever have any improvements, the estimates that we have of the quantity that we'll be able to derive become more and more finalized. But as things become more expensive, there becomes an incentive to try and either find alternatives or develop new methods that are cheaper or that can extract more or that can utilize a given quantity more efficiently. And I mean, this is really appliances now are much, much more efficient than they were in the past. I know my grandmother, she had an old freezer from the 50s in her basement, and it used more power than all of her combined appliances do today. And she, of course, she still has a freezer and a refrigerator and ovens and all manner of other technologies that weren't even there in the past, didn't even exist, and yet all that can run on less amperage than just a freezer did from a couple decades ago. And there's a profit incentive. There's a reason to do that, quite independent of altruistic desire to save the planet, quote unquote, whatever that actually means. Um, but that's just one example. It goes much further than that. People can develop other means of producing energy quite apart from hydrocarbons. Now, the government likes to pick, for very political reasons that have nothing to do with their cost-benefit analysis or how effective they are on the market, because the government cannot gauge market activity because it's divorced from it. They can kind of guess, but it's an extremely arbitrary guess, and that's not even what they do. What they do is they say what's going to look good politically, and that's what they endorse. And um, so they subsidize certain things like wind or solar, even though there's scant evidence that those are very applicable, at least in most cases. I think both of them have niche applicability, in certain situations, but as a kind of a substitute for hydrocarbons, certainly they are not, at least not now. Um, but the other thing is the regulations that they institute are basically retarding potential other developments. And the thing is, people kind of imagine new technologies as, some guy just comes up with a brilliant idea and just off of the races. And yes, that can happen. You can't discount that possibility, but that's relatively unlikely. What's much more likely is people are going to be working towards a goal. They're going to develop technologies towards that goal, and that development will be incremental, and sometimes it will not go near as far as they want. Sometimes it will go a little bit faster, and it will develop alternatives that maybe aren't a silver bullet, but are useful in a certain limited sense. So not necessarily a full replacement of all oil and gas. I think it's kind of unlikely that someone's going to come up with some engine that we can put in all of our cars that's going to do everything or more that hydrocarbons can, and just solve that problem like that. But what people probably will do is they'll come up with a solution that, well, will work in some situations. So there are some electrical cars that make sense in, say, an urban environment where you don't have to drive very far. Well, that's not a solution for everybody, but that's a solution for a percentage of the quote-unquote problem. Likewise, in other scenarios, rail might make more sense. Boating might make more sense. Some other type of engine or transit methodology. Unfortunately, the government basically prevents any of this stuff from really happening. They own the roads. They dictate what kind of products can be brought to market on that medium. So you can't, it's not like a store where, just new foods can be brought in or new producers. They basically say what can be sold, and they everything that's produced has to fit within those constraints. And those constraints are really designed to keep new things out. That's why they are there. Um, that's not the official explanation. The official explanation for regulations is to protect consumers, but the history of their implementation and their effect is actually to um, protect producers and to force consumers to be satisfied with only a limited market. So peak oil is not something I think that we really need to worry about if we have a free market. And the degree that we do, we can hope for solutions to that. However, the government has stratified and ossified the economy in certain areas more than other. And in transportation, it's one area where they've done it an awful lot. And that very much retards development towards alternatives. Not to mention making what we already use more expensive. So uh, I think the idea of peak oil is something of a misnomer. It assumes that there won't be technological change when in all likelihood there will be. Um, and it also takes for granted, this or that geological estimate when those are those are always going to change based on what technologies are available for extraction. So that's pretty much it, and I'll talk to y'all later.